Great. So library as movement. This platform must be collaborative, a place where librarians work directly with community members, companies, institutions, and others. It is these collaborations that drive positive change. This idea transforms the library as a place with services to a movement, a joint effort to constantly advocate for positive change. The role of the librarian is as a facilitator, weaving together increasingly divided populations. The result is a library that reflects the unique nature and aspirations of a people looking to make a better future. Today, Lankes will examine this idea and illustrate the reality of the approach with examples from Denmark, South Korea, Texas, and South Carolina. He's been everywhere. He'll talk about how the core skills of librarians can be extended and directed to the library as a locus of radical positive change. To give you some background about our presenter this morning, R. David Lankes is the Virginia and Charles Bowden Professor of Librarianship at the University of Texas at Austin's School of Information. He is the recipient of ALA's Reference and User Service Association 2021 Isidore Gilbert Mudge Award for distinguished contribution to reference librarianship. His book, The Atlas of New Librarianship, won the 2012 ABC Clio Greenwood Award for the best book in library literature. Lankes is a passionate advocate for librarians and their essential role in today's society. Welcome, David. We are so glad that you are here with us today.
Thank you so much. Can you hear me all right? Do our little AV check.
Audio sounds great, David. Thank you.
All right. I appreciate it. And thank you so much for having me this morning. And thanks for everyone for joining. It's going to, normally I think keynotes, we're used to throwing up lots of slides and getting, but I figured we could just start with a conversation this morning because I know you have an excellent schedule going on in the future. So I'll keep an eye on the chat as well. So unfortunately, this is the grand visual you're going to get for today. But want to talk about some really interesting things and take you on a bit of a trip around what's going on. And we want to talk about libraries movement. And before that, I think we need to step back a moment because oftentimes we don't appreciate the power of narrative, that we look at the idea of what we do, the performance, how we're structured, what our current message is, all of this in a very practical and pragmatic way. And yet what we find is if you take one step back and you think about your library and what it does, it is a rather striking story that we tell. I mean, we're sort of in the story business, whether they're academic scholarly stories, whether they're children's stories, whether they're fiction stories, what have you. And sometimes we don't apply that same concept to what we do. Having a large scale narrative, having the sense of a story to tell gives people one energy within the organization, but also gives a bridge and a way for people to connect to what we're doing. So I'm going to spend a little time today talking about different narratives around libraries, a bit historical, but a lot of what we know is that a lot of the history tends to stick with us on a regular basis, but talk about the evolution of how we see libraries and globally, and how those narratives have shifted and changed and what that means to shift and change for ourselves. So I'm going to talk really about 5 narratives of libraries that have sort of developed around the history. And like I say, you're going to see bits and pieces of this in current practice. But along with those narratives, talking about the different services that come out of them and aligned. And I'll just sort of give away the ending here. Part of the reason we're doing this is because we're in, and we always are, by the way, flux about what that narrative is, right? We're going to talk about book palaces, and we were all about history and humanities and books and materials, and moving then into where information centers and databases and connectivity, and now we're moving into this sort of community hub world and platform and movements and all these kinds of things. And each one of those phase shifts, if you will, there's a time of complexity and a lot of conversation, frankly, a lot of angst. But it also means that we have to spend some time redefining ourselves as librarians and what that comes from. We're going to talk about that in a moment, because right now, there's a lot of librarians who are looking around going, should I be starting a garden, a makerspace, a kitchen? If I'm starting a garden, makerspace, kitchen, seed library, whatever, was that what I learned in library school? And really, don't people just expect us to have materials and all this other stuff? And so having a large scale narrative that fits these things in matters a lot. We'll also talk about some things that I don't think have changed over the 4,000-year history tradition of librarianship, before it was called that, before it was formal, but that some of that mission that we're on and how we define ourselves, our values and our skills are long-term and truly span these different narratives. And so we need to keep that in track. So my goal here is to basically explain why librarians are kind of like farmers. The reason I say that is not because a lovely metaphor about crops and yielding and growing and things, but the idea that really that librarianship has probably like two professions that were developed before us. One is farming, the other is one we don't speak of. But the idea of a farmer over many thousands of years has had the same task, which is to grow crops, feed, distribute, etc. And yet the means by which they do that, their understanding, how they fit in society, all of this has shifted and changed. And yet we still see it as a continuous cycle of evolution and development. Right? Today, farmers are using, combines and collecting mass information. We're talking about industrial scale farming. We're talking about the use of fertilizers, et cetera, and certainly very different than having oxen pull early plows through fields. And yet we can still identify that they are, in fact, farmers and have a common mission. And I'm going to argue that through these different evolutions, and I'm going to really look around past 100 years, the same can be said of librarians. That we have gone from being historians and monks in our collections and evolving into a discipline and a profession, and where he brought into the notion of, graduate degrees and formalization. There's still this core that really takes us through it. And that's not going to change. But the role in what we do with that core, I am going to argue, has changed pretty dramatically. I'm also going to make an argument, just because I'm going to preference things for the next half hour, that in doing that, while our values and such have changed, our role as librarians has fundamentally shifted from maintaining an organization and an institution to maintaining directly the community that we serve. And in doing that, we have truly changed our focus. We have added new skills, and we've added a definite new role to how we look at the future of libraries in doing all these things. Yes, I'm just looking at Laura as the oldest profession. And while we weren't necessarily the oldest profession, we probably organized the materials of the oldest profession. So I'll leave it there. So quick jump through history just for fun. And one of this is how we conceptualize libraries. And once again, moving to this sort of current concept of the library as a movement. So the first era I want to talk about is the book palace era. This is the idea that we built institutions of all sorts and scales and sizes to maintain the records of humanity, the core of human knowledge in the form of books and manuscripts and materials and physical items. And certainly this was given partially because of the technology at the time. I've reminded regularly the idea of Ranganathan's laws of every reader its book, every book its reader, et cetera. I think if Ranganathan was working today, he would be talking about every resource, its user, et cetera. And I hate users, but we'll come back to that in a minute. And so the notion is that the book palace was collection-centric, building different collections, how we organize those collections, and that concept of bringing people in as either refuge, as some places of entertainment. Early 18th century libraries in the UK actually had billiards rooms and gaming tables in the library to try and attract people away from the pubs. Right? There was a moral aspect to what libraries do. There is this valor concept that really pervades libraries throughout. And so we have this concept of the book palace. The librarian was one who maintained that collection, maintained those resources. The value was in collection, was in aggregation, was in access. That was the primary thing we did. And when we looked at how we sort of organized those things, we did some amazing things. The book palace concept, I'm not saying this is the traditional library. I'm really looking at a point in time. And some of the massive efforts that really we benefit today from this conceptualization, from this narrative of libraries, are things like open shelving, that we brought the idea of take the chains off the books, make the books browsable, make it a more democratic process to access this material. The concepts of open access, while today has a very different sense in terms of payment and cost, but the concept that access for all might be another way of putting that. I often tell my students about, many people talk about the first public library in Philadelphia as Benjamin Franklin's library, which it wasn't. Benjamin Franklin's library was a subscription library. More or less, he and many of his other well-to-do friends had too many books to put in their own institutions, wanted to share them on a regular basis. And so they rented a space, put them together, and then charged subscription to be part of it. The first public library in Philadelphia was the Free Library of Philadelphia, which is still very much a going concern and a great library today, founded by, and I'm not making this up, Dr. Pepper at the University of Pennsylvania, who had a fair amount of fortune from his father, the elder Dr. Pepper, also a professor. And that was where they granted resources, money, eventually facilities and such, to make these resources available to all the citizens of Philadelphia, regardless of their ability to pay. So the book palace era really is something that, once again, we still resonate with today. We know it's turned into a stereotype. We know that people often minimize what libraries do simply to books and materials, but we know the power of reading. We know the power of literacy. We see this even, once again, in very interesting and amazing features now. When I was at the University of South Carolina, one of the weird things that came with the job when I was director of the Library Science School is that the university had the mascot for the, in fact, I can show it. So we'll have a little show and tell today. The mascot for the university was Cocky. This is Cocky. We were the Gamecocks. And Cocky, there were two Cockies at the University of South Carolina. I know you really care. One of them worked for the athletic department, because, you know, it does that. But the other worked for me as the director of the library science program. And the reason she worked, it was always a surprise and a hidden secret. The reason this person worked for the library school is they were part of something called Cocky's Reading Express. And so what would happen on a regular basis throughout the school year is, on a big bus, they would put Cocky, and they would put undergraduates from across the university. They would drive to the poorest schools in the state. Cocky would get out. Cocky was a big deal in South Carolina. We don't have a pro football team. Well, we do, but it's the University of South Carolina or Clemson, but we don't talk about Clemson. And they'd get out and the kids would be energized and excited, and they'd do story time, and Cocky would act out the story. And then they would hand out books to the students, and they would all take Cocky's reading pledge, to read 20 minutes a night. That was connected to, once a year, the state library would organize, and the same group would organize, a march upon the Capitol, a literacy read-in, where preschools, kindergartens, elementary schools would bus people from around the state in. They would literally march upon the Capitol, surround the Capitol grounds, take up the major steps into the Capitol. The superintendent of education for the state librarian would come out, Cocky would come out. They'd all come and they would read and do story time and announce the importance of literacy into the government. This power of book, the power of reading, the power of literacy, oftentimes we see it de-emphasized, or, once again, it becomes the idea of a stereotype. Oh, you're all about books. You're a librarian. You must love to read a lot. It's like, I'd love to. I wish I had time. Right? All of this comes from this concept of the book palace. And so it's a rich narrative, but it's one that sort of foundered a bit as we began to look at community needs and communities change, because we are a dynamic profession because our communities are dynamic communities. As communities change, as communities evolve, so do active, lively professions go in. And so we saw that in the 80s, when technology was moving out of the laboratory, out of business, and into personal computers and personal technology, and certainly with the advent of connectivity through the internet and really into the late 90s and early 2000s, a new narrative emerged around librarianship, our sort of the story we told about why we're here, why you need us, what we're trying to do, how you can understand us. And that was the concept of the information center. So we talked about the library as the place to get connected. This was when we really pushed hard, and we still do. Once again, these don't disappear, but the idea of connectivity, right? That we became the public access point to the internet. If you didn't have it in your dorm room, if you didn't have it in your home, if you couldn't access it or afford it, you could come to the library. And we used lots of statistics about how 90+% of the US population could access the internet because they had access through the library. This was the lovely days of the Gates Foundation, and when Bill was dropping us off public access computers on a regular basis that unfortunately are still lying around in some of our machines, or sorry, some of our libraries. But this was the concept of the information center. The librarian was recast as the sort of wise sage from Desk Set and Katharine Hepburn being able to recite 80-verse epic poems from memory into the finder, the information professional. And so libraries became information centers, we became information professionals, and our patronage, turned to users. Now, the standard joke I use is that only two professions have users. One are computer scientists and the others are drug dealers. But we're going to come back to, I actually found a use for the word user. But this was the notion of we had users, we came in, we worried about the interfaces, we moved our massive physical CD-ROM towers online, and we provided access, and we've been desperately working forever to try and come up with an interface to 300 different databases on a regular basis. We took classes, and our classes were no longer about reference and reading advisory and cataloging, because cataloging quickly became copy cataloging in a networked era, and copy cataloging really decimated the ranks of original cataloging, to user-centered user services. We even looked at the transformation of reference from reference resources and materials to reference as a function, answering questions, the reference encounter, all of these notions, virtual reference, digital reference, this all came around the idea of an information center. And we saw, for example, mass digitization efforts. And we digitized everything we could get our hands on. And we built digital libraries. And we talked about metadata. Once again, all things that, while that was the focus, still serve us today. We still worry about interfaces and making things easy to find. Many people I've said, Google is the competitor of libraries. I said, no, Google is the best gift libraries ever got. It solved our document delivery problem. We no longer had to worry about finding it and posting it and sending it out. We could simply send a URL and people could find these and link these, etc. So this information center is still very much with us. We talk about, once again, our value, our access, our paid access and paid walls, and how do we find information within it. Benefits are, we became a technological profession. Now, we were always a technological profession. Cataloging, AACR2, metadata, all this stuff, these are technologies. They may be and are implemented in code now, but even the process, the rules, the regulations, the format, all of that is a technical part of our profession. And metadata has served us well. Distributed catalogs have served us well. Catalogs and integrated library systems have gotten better. We have looked at how we can better serve people online, and we certainly saw one of the great moments of the information center legacy that we had built and we're suddenly seeing the benefits, was during COVID, when we had to close our buildings. And I remember the first month of lockdowns were a lot of librarians walking around going, what now? Well, let's at least leave the Wi-Fi on so people can come to our parking lots, and let's boost the power. And then that quickly turned into, let's license more ebooks so we can distribute ebooks. And then that quickly transformed past that to, hey, we can do YouTube videos and we can do Zoom calls and we can have participants come and do collections and organizing. And we can use this technology infrastructure that we have built for our hybrid environments. We can still use those. I'm going to talk about the University of Toronto a couple of times, but let me talk about one now. Early days of COVID, the librarians would call their users at the time, customers is another word that I hate, but we'll stick with for a moment. They called their communities just to make sure they were okay. They called people that they knew were elderly, that they knew had limited access and mobility, that they knew had limited resources, and they picked up the phone and reached out to say, are you okay? That infrastructure to build community was built there because we looked at information centers. We saw that in library after library, Chattanooga is one great example, where they speaker series or online writers guilds or different programming that they might have done, where if they had 50 people, they had 40 people show up, it was an amazing response. Suddenly in COVID land, remote land, Zoom land, they were having thousands of people signed up, hundreds and hundreds of people working together. This was the legacy of the information center narrative that we still benefit from today. But over the past 20 years, probably concentrated that into the last 10 years, we've seen the emergence of the third space. That is that we look at libraries not as that place to access rare and scarce materials alone, or as a place that will license things and that you can come and utilize them, but as places to be a community, whether that community is in a town, whether that community is in a university, whether that community is in a school, a common variable, where I live, where I work, what I do, surrounded by a system to allocate scarce resources. That's what a community is, whether it's how to get tax money, how to get tuition money, how to get space, how to get attention. And the third space became that place that wasn't work and wasn't home, and it was a place to be a community based on Oldenburg's concepts out of sociology. And we used different words for it. We called it an agora, we called it the people's university, but it was that idea of the place is important. Several people talked about the library as the living room of the community. And not only did we provide materials and books and maker spaces and access to data, but things people could do. Actually, I'm sorry, that's when maker spaces sort of made sense. When people would come in and learn not just from what was written, but learn from what was done. Fayetteville Free Library, a small suburban library in upstate New York, put in 6 very complicated, very impressive sewing machines, as well as 6 3D printing machines. The funny thing is the librarians had no problem supporting and talking and helping people work with the 3D printers. The sewing machines terrified them. But the reason they did this was not so the librarians could teach sewing or librarians could sew, but because they knew there was a community of people working in knitting and sewing and the fiber arts, and they could come and utilize this. And then once they came and utilized this, they said, great, now teach everyone else. Wouldn't it be great to invite other people to do it? And they did. And I was interviewing some of the seamstresses at the time. And I said, so what do you think of this? And she goes, I have no idea why they have sewing machines in the library, because these librarians don't know how to sew. Not realizing that she was the one who was the expert and she was the community resource, that she was part of the library because she was part of the community. And so we shifted our focus now to that community, but we were still very focused on the tools that we as librarians could provide: a space, materials, resources, training, etc. And so our third space really became the idea of taking everything we did around literacy, books, and materials, using our technological hybrid environment from the information center, and now looking at the space itself as valuable for communities to come together. And we began to shift from collection development to connection development. How do we hook up people together? How do we find common interests? How do they share passions? How do they work on these different things? And so I'm going to argue that now in the very shorter term, 5-year time frame and moving forward, we're shifting to yet a new narrative. And if it seems like these narratives are getting shorter, and they are, but once again, they're building together. And the new narrative is around the idea of the library, not just as a third space, but the library as a function of and within the community, not just confined to our buildings, but everywhere it's happening. And more importantly, that the actors, the people with agency, the people who have power in the library, doesn't just include the library staff, that the community at large has the ability to be part of and provide and drive and become the library itself. And so the first sort of discussion around this was the library as platform. And this is a bit of an academic conversation, I admit, but we can see it emerging in different ways. And I want to give a couple of examples. So the library as platform is the concept from technology, that a platform is a number of systems that are combined and can interoperate, right? So if you think about, for example, the integrated library systems is really more of a platform than a piece of software. It allows you to do inventory. It allows you to do digital resources and licensing. It allows you to do front-end searching, et cetera. So it's a bunch of functionality put together as a platform. And the importance of viewing platforms is that instead of simply, well, we have systems or we have software, what's the difference? Is that when you put these bits of functionality together, you don't dictate what that turns into once it's implemented. All right, that's obscure, so give me a second. I'm going to use Facebook as an example of a platform. A platform, so of course, my children will tell me, so when you're old and you go onto Facebook, when you go onto Facebook, it's actually pretty simple what Facebook does, aside from selling your data, but we'll get there later. It allows you to find friends, connect to friends, make a post on a wall that your friends can see. And that's most of what it does. It's an advertising platform, but from the use standpoint, that's pretty much what it does. But what happens is they've opened it up so it can also include quizzes. What Harry Potter house will you be put into? It becomes a functionality where you can take a quiz, you can post it, you can advertise it. Now you can have your own groups, so you can create groups around a reading group or an institution, right? So you can suddenly see this massive discussion, this massive interaction in social world that begins from relatively simple functionality. This is the concept of infrastructure, right? It's like we built a highway, but over that highway goes people visiting friends, goes commerce, goes law enforcement, goes fire, goes et cetera, right? So this is the idea of a platform. And so the library, if we don't think of it as something that does something, a library is something that provides records, documents, et cetera. But we think of it as a series of functionalities, right? So we have inventory, we have space, we have logistical support, we have expertise and consulting, we have the ability to organize groups and convenings, et cetera. And then you go to a community and say, what can you do with this platform? So a very specific library example, COVID example again, because, it's over. Anyway, COVID example, which is in Toronto, the Toronto Public Library, lockdown, everything's closed. Across the city, there was a massive unanticipated consequence. I'm sorry, I had to respond to this. Yes, there is a cocky librarian hat. Very good. You can order it. It's great. So it's lockdown, etc. One of the things that became very important during the lockdown was access to food. People were either out of work, people couldn't go out that much, they didn't have resources, they needed food pantries. And the food pantries, that there were several excellent ones, about 90 throughout the city, had a problem, which is they were mostly volunteer driven. And the problem with being mostly volunteer driven, as we know in the United States, the biggest part of the volunteer community are elders and people over 65. A targeted population specifically around COVID, which is they really needed to stay home. They needed extra protection. They needed to not come into areas of public discourse and public interactions, such as a food pantry. And so they closed. And Victory Bowles, who's the director, reached out to her librarians, asked for volunteers, very important, didn't instruct or enforce, but asked for volunteers. And many of the librarians and library staff stood up and said, absolutely, let us help in this situation. And they set up food pantries in branches of the Toronto Public Library around the city. And they began taking food and distributing food. And it went horribly. And it went very badly because it turns out food pantry distribution and systems that they were using didn't work very well. A truck would show up at a grocery store or a restaurant, say, do you have any extra food? Go on the truck would drive to the first food pantry, distribute food, second, distribute with food. By the time they were at the fifth, it was like, here's a cup of soup and stovetop stuffing, right? And so the librarians looked at this and said, okay, this is not working. And they looked at their capabilities, their platform, and said, can we do this better? And they said, you know what? We do this better on a regular basis. We have a logistical and distribution center for our materials and books. And so what they did is they said, all right, food pantry folks, we're not doing this anymore. All food you pick up is delivered to our distribution hub, which was where we used to push books between branches. And not only that, we're going to create, satchels, bags full of sort of balanced meals and foods and a book and materials. And that's going to then be distributed by our drivers, just like they used to drive around distributing books for holds and transfers. They're going to be distributing food and material. And by God, it was amazing. It was written up. It was incredible. This idea that they were providing food, librarians were there, which meant it was also a trusted resource. People from the community were coming in to get food, but also there was their librarian that they had worked with before. They were connecting. They felt like they weren't alone. And that some of that service is still ongoing. And so that's the idea of a platform where it wasn't built to do food distribution, but it turns out it can do food distribution. A library wasn't built to have people come in and do concerts and such, and yet that's what was happening. In Chattanooga that I mentioned, they were suddenly using all of their public services staff that was used to doing programming. Suddenly they were going to YouTube and they were doing Tai Chi for one community and Dungeons and Dragons for the others. And they produced a whole sort of television station of materials that were going out. And once again, thousands of users going on. That agility comes from looking at the library, not as we do this so much as we have these capabilities that can be implemented in different ways. We see it through technology. One thing that we're seeing is the use of our infrastructure to go to small and low tech and low overhead organizations, small restaurants, small not-for-profits that don't have the ability to have a web page that is essential these days to knowing that they exist. And they're building a community portal where the library will host their website, their web service. And in return, suddenly that becomes part of a network where the librarians know that's a resource and they can refer people to it, connect people, et cetera. Platform. And a platform is a way of looking at the things that we've done before, but looking at the community as our function, right? It is not to fix the community. It is to enable the community to aspire to its own goals, right? We talk about dreams. We move out of a deficit model. We move out of the concept of a user, someone who comes in and uses us, or worse, customer. Ugh. Don't ever use customer. I know you do, and I know it's fine, and I get it. But ultimately, what it means is that we put ourselves in a transactional relationship with our communities. They come in and they use us. They come in and get their value and leave. And the platform idea is, no. We come in and we help you be brilliant, but your brilliance is what we're trying to do. By the way, what do I put in place of customer, just in case it shows up? I use member, as in a member of the community. And to be really clear, what a library and a community call themselves is up to that group, right? So if you have a community and a library and you have an honest conversation and they say, I want to be treated like a customer, I get it. If you're in an academic environment and you use something crazy like faculty and students, absolutely. If you're in a small branch and you call them neighbors, great. And if you can call them by their name, even better. But what term we use about those folks that are served by this platform matters. And I think we need to be really clear that what we're trying to do is enhance a community, not enable and facilitate rapid transactions. We're trying to build relationships. And that's where we begin to move from the idea of platform to what I think is a much more powerful concept, and that is movement. The library as a movement. Because in a book palace, it's all about potential. We imagine what could happen if you had access to this documented, recorded history, right? Imagine the writers who could be inspired. Imagine the children who can be inspired to read. Imagine people who could think larger. We know about the power of narratives. We know that in areas where women are oppressed, where women have no rights, we know that one way to transform and change whole societies, to enable the power of women to improve the society, is allowing the women to access to education. And access to education is access to narratives. They can dream beyond the stories they've been told. They can see other environments in which women have a different world. And by imagining, by seeing, by picturing, by being told about a wider world, people can dream bigger and lead to action. So the book palace is potential. We are a potential energy. We harness the potential to make a change. Same with Information Center. Information Center, if you look at the narratives, we provide connectivity, we provide tools, we empower people because technology is all around us and we can give you the survival skills to do it. But the Information Center narrative is extraordinarily tied with the concept of neutrality and objectivity, that information is a neutral thing, that by providing connectivity, we are doing a neutral thing. Of course, you provide connectivity, but that's not a neutral act. Right? Technology is not neutral. Technology that costs $3,000 doesn't allow everyone to succeed. It allows people to succeed that have $3,000. Right? These are not neutral choices and decisions. And so when we moved to third space, we began to introduce the concept that these spaces aren't just neutral. They're not just about a social safety net and objectivity. They are about transformation. The third space, the platform, are about leading to action. And that action, that agency, that advocacy, that, dare I say, activism, needs to have a perspective. And therefore, we have to shed the concept of being libraries as neutral spaces, libraries as objective spaces, and we need to start talking about libraries as enabling spaces and activist spaces, energizing. And oftentimes we use lovely neutral sounding terms like empower. We're going to empower our readers, empower our customers, empower our members. But the root of that word is power. It's the idea of to gain and distribute power, which ultimately is a political act. It's an act where you have haves and have-nots, where you deliberately create situations and systems that can include or exclude. And we know this for a long time. Libraries have pushed hard to be areas of literacy to help people become more literate. And we do that through the love of reading. But we've also built a massively imposing and dangerous space for the illiterate. If you're illiterate, if your identity and how you work through society is based on your ability to read, libraries are not welcoming spaces. Now, this doesn't even get into the concept of minoritized communities. Whether you're Black, whether you're trans, and you feel welcome in these spaces. We have to make them that way. And so the platform is even too passive. And so we now begin to talk about the library as movement. And that is the idea of building agencies within our communities to advocate, to argue, to come to terms, and ultimately to allocate resources to a better tomorrow, which means you have to have a vision of what a better tomorrow is. And this is going to be very scary, because what we begin to see is the idea that is not about our buildings and our stacks. When we talk about empowerment, when we talk about making a better future, when we talk about aspirations, we're talking about people. We're talking about human agency. And we're talking about librarians now, not as caretakers or as stewards, but as activists. We're talking about, if we believe that literacy is an essential skill to survive and thrive in this world, we are going to fight for literacy. We're not going to simply enable it and have some materials in case someone decides they need a good book. We're going to go out there, get on the buses with Cocky, go to the poorest schools and say, this is why literacy is important. Because if you're not reading by at reading level at third grade, then the percentages of you getting through high school drop dramatically. And if you don't graduate high school, the potential of imprisonment rises dramatically. And it all happens from a zip code that you're born in. Prediction of economic well-being, prediction of incarceration, prediction of educational achievement in the United States, the primary factor that is true across the nation is zip code, where you are born and where you live. And if you're a library in one of those zip codes, you're not happy and you shouldn't be satisfied. And you should work like hell to make sure that we improve the lives of people. And we're willing to not only do that by access to materials, but by raising a voice. And this is the most important part, raising the voice of those that we serve. True advocacy in our field is not about we love the library needs more money. It's about communities that need a voice and a place at the table. It's about communities that have needs for social services and resources, but also hope and good schools and good access to healthcare. And so if you're in Pottsboro, Texas, a town of 1,200 people in very rural Texas, and the closest hospital is 2 hours away, and it's a pandemic, and you're worried about, does your child's cough really mean a beginning of a bad situation? And you're a library in that environment, you do something crazy like take an old closet, clean it out, put a bunch of lights, a high bandwidth connection, and build a relationship with that hospital 2 hours away and build a telehealth center. That's Pottsboro, Texas. 1,200 people, has a telehealth facility in the library, has an exterior door code that people can go in, and the logistics, and I want to be really clear about this platform thing, are not handled by the librarians. It's handled by the hospital that knows how to do that, because that's the other part of the movement. It's not just us moving, it's us getting people to move, bringing healthcare and hospitals together to move forward. And that's what we begin to talk about, right? It's the idea that if you're in Charleston, South Carolina, and you are looking at a situation where in your rural communities, food deserts exist, you create a locker full of fresh produce and food, and you stock it on a regular basis, and you charge $0, and there's no enrollment in a program. You walk into the library, you grab food, you walk out. You walk into the library, you study, you read, you get hungry, you eat an apple. Because everyone should have access to that food and that material. Or you're the Free Library of Philadelphia, and in the middle of your newly renovated library, once in a century renovation, you build at the core a kitchen that allows people to come and cook, which sounds interesting, but you're in the middle of downtown Philadelphia. You're in a food desert where the only ready access to food is through convenience stores to processed foods, full of sugar, full of all the horrible things people shouldn't have. And so what do? We give them some fresh produce and expect them to somehow know what to do with a radish? And so a library, you look at that and say, come to the library. We're not just going to give you a cookbook. Come, let me show you. And you begin to cook and you begin to feed your cities. You begin to feed their brains as well as their bodies. And you begin to talk about how important this is. And once you begin feeding them and doing lessons not taught by librarians, but by chefs and by folks in the community. And then you would begin to invite home chefs to come in and cook. And then you begin to invite new citizens and immigrants to come in and to cook together and to break bread together and to share together. The library is a movement. It's a set of resources, a set of platforms, but the librarians sit not in front of, not above, not behind, but beside community members to say, this is what we need. We talk about democracy. This is what democratic access looks like. Yes, we set up a polling place, but we also look how our bookmobiles can do voter registration, if this is what we really are talking about. It's vaccination, where we talk about, yes, you can get vaccinated here, but we also have every one of our librarians putting up testimonials as to why they were vaccinated, and showing the trust that they had built from working, not transacting, but working with their members over years and years, and saying, hey, we built trust. This is something that I need you to understand and think about. And I'm going to use that trust to make a better community. That's the idea of a movement. And we can actually reintroduce the concept of user, but it's a very different concept now. The user of a library may be a community member, maybe a small business, maybe a doctor, maybe a trans kid looking for some relief. But so is the librarian. The librarian is a user of the library because they're standing side by side with this community member. And so they're going to go and use the facility, use the resource, use the mechanism, et cetera. But once again, the library becomes a collection of capabilities. It's the librarian that is empowering. And what that looks like in Philadelphia and what that looks like in Des Moines and what that looks like in Springfield and what that looks like, whatever, is going to be radically different. And that's the next thing that we have to get ready for. Over a century since Melville Dewey and his friends hung out in Philadelphia at the Centennial meeting and decided that we needed the American Library Association, and the Dewey Decimal System came out and the Cutter systems, and we came up with all of these cataloging rules, and we looked at the idea of libraries as efficiencies. There is still a narrative that was constructed literally in the middle of mass industrialization when people like Dewey said librarianship must be industrialized. At the same time, we were looking at our classrooms and saying it's not about 10 kids, it has to be 30 kids, and we have to run them through the assembly line of knowledge. The library had to move at that industrial scale, and it had to be efficient. Cataloging, forget it, copy cataloging. One library catalogs it, it gets shared, efficiency. We even see it now when we do our budgets. How are we efficient stewards of our community's resources? That narrative of best practice, of toolkits, of replication of standard after standard after standard, which makes every library look the same because it's efficient, needs to go away. Every library is a platform. And that platform needs to look like the community it is seeking to improve and be part of. And that means in Springfield and in Seoul and around the world, in Denmark, et cetera, those libraries are going to look very, very different from each other, but they're going to look a lot like their community. There is not one future for libraries. There are as many futures as there are libraries. And the role of the librarian is not to enforce a standard or implement a standard or find a best practice. The role of a librarian is first and foremost to listen and stand at the side of a community member to help that community member find meaning in their lives and help that community make a smarter decision. And what they also do is they look around. They look around at other libraries, but they look around at other industry. They look around at other nonprofits, and they say, these are the kinds of things that my community needs, and they adapt them. They don't adopt them. They don't just take them and plop them in. They adapt them. They craft them to the local need. And that means that by doing that again and again, the collection, the building, the services all look different from each other. And that's the next function of a librarian. The new function of a librarian is to connect to other librarians, to constantly say, hey, we're trying this. What do you think? Hey, what are you trying? What do you think? And adapting concepts and identifying great ideas. What our associations need to become, what our state libraries need to become, are maker spaces of librarianship. Communal places of conversation where not only do librarians sit side by side, but we bring in our mayors and our town councilors and our provosts and our professors, and we sit on a regular basis and say, what are we going to do today? And how's that going to look there and there and there? Not, here's the standard, let's all do it. And that's very different. And that means as librarians, we also need to think differently. First thing we need to do is understand there are really 3 different ways to become a librarian. One, yes, is through a master's science at a high quality institution, such as the University of Texas. And I like that because it keeps me employed. And it has efficiencies, which I know I just said about efficiency, but it brings people together. It lets us concentrate learning, and it creates a place where people can fail and it's okay. Right? You don't go into social media and say, we tried it, and have all your coworkers go, that was stupid. You can try it here, and I can tell you. It's a safe place to explore this profession, but it's only one way. The other way is that we know you get hired and someone says, you're the librarian. In rural America, a huge percentage of the people who are librarians and library directors have no formal education or preparation, and that's problematic. We had one person who was hired as a librarian in a rural library here in Texas, and her first purchase was the chain to go around her neck to connect to her reading glasses, because that's what librarians did. That's a problem. And so looking at librarians by title, those that are hired, we need to build networks that recognize them, that yes, build their skills, but then also build their legitimacy and respect. If I'm a librarian and I'm working in a rural area and I may not have even finished college, my undergraduate degree, I need to have a place that I can learn, to thrive, and a community that welcomes me, and some validation so that when in a rural community, someone walks up and says, all of these LGBTQ books need to go because that's not God's will, like that librarian needs to have a sense of validation and legitimacy to stand up and say, no, that's not what's going to happen. And the third way that we often disregard are librarians by spirit. These are the mayors, these are the provosts, these are the people who understand the value of transformational action within communities, people who support us. And we need to welcome, include, and reach out and build networks so that ultimately our library is a movement of librarians, of our co-workers, our members, people sitting next to us, our mayors, our bankers, our whatever it is, working together to say, we are weaving together community through knowledge and learning, and yes, access to materials and resources, but even more importantly, access to each other so that we can make a better community. We can overcome ideological divides. We can weave together people that don't agree, and we can set norms where it says intolerance is not accepted here, where diversity is expected, where we understand that the richest learning comes from the richest resources, where the library becomes a safe place to explore dangerous ideas. That's what we're about. That's the notion of a movement. And so, yes, do we have books? Yes. Do we respect and improve literacy? Absolutely. Do we provide access to resources and materials and help people live and thrive in a technological environment? Absolutely. Are we a place for a community to gather, to be a community, to get outside of commerce, to get outside of their home situations? 100%. And are we a platform that allows communities to advance new concepts new? Yes, but ultimately what we're there for is not to offer books and be a building and have people transact. We are there to make a better tomorrow. We are there to start a movement. We are there to save our communities as much as we are there to serve our communities. And that takes a lot of support and a lot of connections and a lot of being a librarian and connecting to other librarians and lifting each other up and being, by the way, paid fairly and taking care of our own wellness as part of it and understanding that labor is not free and cheap and that mental labor costs things and we should acknowledge it. All of that has to happen as we seek a better world for ourselves and a better world for the community. So today, you're going to hear a lot of different ideas, and that's amazing. Take them, think about them, brew them, but ultimately don't adopt them. Adapt them. Be the person who understands your local situation well enough that you'll know what works, what doesn't work, and be willing to experiment and try. They named the building after us, not the other way around. Thank you very much. I appreciate your time this morning. I don't know if we have time for questions or answers, but I do appreciate the conversation. Always open via email. Let me know. I love to talk. I love to learn. I love to hear what's going on.
I am so inspired, and I will tell you, I've been monitoring the chat as this is going on. And to be honest, I haven't seen questions, and we're almost at time. But I love this idea of adapting, of agility, of connectedness. I think I have about 3 pages of feverishly written notes to kind of think about. So just from everything that I'm seeing here, thank you so much for your presentation today, and actually really putting in context how to think about the rest of the day. And like you said, that adaptability. So thank you.